Hey everyone! Today we're diving into a pretty game-changing period in history, the Protestant Reformation. This was no small event. It reshaped Europe's religious, cultural, and political landscape and had ripple effects that are still felt today. The Reformation kicked off in 1517, led by Martin Luther, and continued until about 1648, around the end of the 30 Years' War. But really, the seeds of change had been growing for a long time before that. The medieval church was incredibly powerful. Think of it as the ultimate authority on everything from spiritual matters to political decisions. But with that power came corruption. Many church leaders were more focused on wealth and influence than on guiding people spiritually. The Bible was only available in Latin, so regular people couldn't read it themselves. Services, prayers, everything, also in Latin, meaning people often didn't understand much of it. This setup left most Christians disconnected from their faith, with the church as the gatekeeper, interpreting everything for them. People started to question this. They saw church leaders living in luxury while they preached poverty to the masses. This didn't sit well, and voices of dissent started rising. Early reformers, like John Wycliffe in England, argued that everyone should have access to the Bible and that the church hierarchy itself wasn't biblically sound. Wycliffe even worked to translate the Bible from Latin into Middle English, making it accessible to the public for the first time. Wycliffe's ideas inspired others, like Jan Hus in Bohemia, who pushed for reform at great personal risk. He was especially vocal against indulgences, a system where people could essentially buy their way out of purgatory. The church didn't take kindly to this. Hus was arrested and eventually burned at the stake. But his followers didn't give up. They kept pushing for change, which led to the Hussite Wars, a series of conflicts between Hus's supporters and the church. These early reformers set the stage for the Protestant Reformation, even though most of them didn't initially want to break away from the church. They simply wanted to bring it back to what they saw as its roots. But with so much resistance from church authorities, it wasn't long before full-on schisms began, leading to the rise of Protestant Christian sects, Lutheranism, Calvinism, Anglicanism, and more. The Reformation not only changed religion but also helped shape the modern era. The invention of the printing press was a game-changer, allowing ideas and translated Bibles to spread quickly. This explosion of information meant more people could question the church's teachings and form their own interpretations of faith. And so, the tight grip of the church began to loosen, opening the door to a new era in European history. And now let's talk about Martin Luther and how he shook things up with his stand against indulgences. Now, we all know Luther as one of the main figures in the Protestant Reformation, but at first, he was just a German monk who was deeply troubled by what he saw around him. Specifically, he took issue with the church selling indulgences, a practice that promised people a shortcut through purgatory for a price. Luther wasn't alone in his frustration, but he became the spark that started the fire. Back in 1517, Johann Tetzel, a Dominican friar, arrived in Luther's area with a mission to sell indulgences. Tetzel was raising funds to rebuild St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, and was quite the salesman, even popularizing the phrase, "When the gold in the coffer rings, the rescued soul to heaven springs." Essentially, people believed that paying up would release their loved ones from purgatory and into heaven, or even speed up their own path after death. For Luther, this felt like a huge spiritual con. He believed salvation was about faith, not money. So, on October 31st, 1517, Luther wrote his famous 95 Theses, a series of arguments against indulgences and church practices, and posted them. Whether he nailed them to a church door or just sent them to his bishop, the theses were soon copied and spread far and wide, thanks to the printing press. Suddenly, Luther's message was all over Germany, and soon it reached other countries like France and England. Luther's stance went way beyond indulgences. He challenged the very authority of the Pope and the Church's hierarchy. He argued that only faith in Scripture should guide a believer's life. He even questioned purgatory itself, saying if the Pope truly had the power to free souls from purgatory, he should do it out of love, not for money. By 1550, Pope Leo X had had enough of Luther's rebellion and ordered him to take it all back or face excommunication. Luther refused and famously burned the Pope's order in public. He was excommunicated in 1521, meaning, in the Church's eyes, he was cut off from God's grace. Soon after, he was summoned to a meeting of secular authorities at the Diet of Worms, where he was again asked to recant. Luther held firm, famously saying he could not act against his conscience. Frederick III of Saxony, who was a powerful supporter of Luther, arranged a fake kidnapping to hide him away in Wartburg Castle for his safety. There, Luther began translating the Bible into German, making it accessible to everyday people for the first time. This Bible became a bestseller, spreading his ideas even further. Luther's resistance inspired others, even sparking the German Peasants' War in 1524. Although he didn't support the violent uprisings, his stand against church authority gave people the courage to question the systems around them. Luther's movement kept growing, spreading through Germany and beyond, forever changing the course of European history. And now let's dive into some of the other reformers who helped shape this movement alongside Martin Luther. Now, while Luther's ideas had certainly spread, he wasn't the only one leading this charge. Others across Europe were also pushing for change, sometimes inspired by Luther and sometimes independently. One key figure was Huldrych Zwingli in Switzerland. Zwingli, a priest and scholar, started his own reform in 1519, around the same time Luther's ideas were catching fire. He was influenced by Desiderius Erasmus, a Dutch priest and philosopher who believed that the church should be reformed from within. Like Luther, Zwingli opposed indulgences, saint veneration, and elaborate religious icons, but they had one big disagreement: the interpretation of the Eucharist, or the Last Supper. While Luther saw the Eucharist as a key part of Christian life, Zwingli felt that putting too much focus on it came too close to idol worship. Then there was John Calvin, a French lawyer whose take on the Reformation would create a movement all its own. Calvin was influenced by Luther's writings but brought his own spin on reform ideas. After fleeing Catholic persecution in France, he settled in Basel, Switzerland, and in 1536, he published Institutes of the Christian Religion, which laid out his beliefs. Calvin argued that individuals could connect directly with God without needing the church as an intermediary. He valued simplicity and saw Scripture as the core of Christian practice. Calvin's strict views and intolerance toward those he saw as heretics eventually made him a sort of enforcer of faith, as he upheld a version of Christianity that broke away from the traditions of the Catholic Church. And while reformers like Zwingli and Calvin were primarily focused on spiritual issues, others saw practical benefits in joining the movement. King Henry VIII of England is probably the most famous example of this. Henry's break from the Catholic Church wasn't only about wanting a divorce, though that was certainly part of it. By splitting from Rome, he could seize church lands in England, gain massive wealth, and remove the Pope's political power from his kingdom. By forming the Church of England, Henry effectively made himself both king and spiritual leader, giving him control over both his people's faith and their politics. Henry's move inspired other nobles and leaders who saw the advantages of separating from the church, which had held significant influence over land, succession, and even wars for centuries. Aligning with the Protestant cause allowed these leaders more freedom from the church's political grip. Of course, these changes didn't come peacefully. Across Europe, violent clashes broke out, with monasteries, churches, and religious art being destroyed by reformers. In Scotland, the reformer John Knox even encouraged the dismantling of churches and monasteries to make sure the old Catholic order couldn't regain its hold. In 1555, the Peace of Augsburg sought to bring some order by allowing monarchs to choose either Catholicism or Lutheranism for their region, which would then become the official faith for everyone there. But the religious tension was far from over. The Catholic Church launched its Counter-Reformation to address some of the criticisms, making adjustments like reforming indulgences and instituting other changes, hoping to reclaim some lost ground. However, these conflicts persisted and eventually contributed to the outbreak of the 30 Years' War, which lasted from 1618 to 1648. This war was devastating, with millions of lives lost, and it ended with the Peace of Westphalia, which reinforced that each nation could determine its official religion, with people allowed to privately practice their faith even if it differed from the state's choice. The Reformation's impact ran deep. Literacy rates climbed as Protestants encouraged everyone to read the Bible for themselves. Education became a priority, and thanks to the printing press, books and ideas spread faster than ever. This era even laid the groundwork for democratic ideas as new Protestant countries began forming, driven by a rising sense of nationalism. While the reformers may not have anticipated the full extent of the impact, their movement sparked a wave of transformation across Europe, from government structures to personal freedoms. And in many ways, the Reformation continues today, as different denominations offer their own perspectives on Christian faith and doctrine, each claiming their own interpretation as truth.